Hello, everyone. This is Professor Stanis Grigoris from Columbia University. Today, we will be doing a session on the philosophy of Aristotle, who is, of course, one of the great, not just one of the great Greek philosophers, but one of the founders of philosophy, quite obviously. I should say from the outset that the idea of doing Aristotle in an hour's time is, in fact, impossible. So we will concentrate on just a few things. In fact, sort of three words, and around them speak a little more generally about some of his ideas. And I will talk about this in a minute. Before I do that, I should say some basic things about Aristotle, about Aristotle's biography. His dates are 384 to 322. He was born in Stagira, which is a city in Macedonia, northern Greece. That is to say, though he spent most of his time in Athens and wrote in Athens, he's not an Athenian. This is something that needs to be underlined, and I will also get back to it later shortly. He came to Athens when he was about 18 and was one of Plato's students. In Plato's academy. It's very important, obviously, to also underline that though he was a student of Plato, Aristotle's philosophy is significantly different from Plato's. And in many ways, we often think of them as somewhat adversaries in a kind of history of philosophy, even if in complementary fashion. When Plato died, Aristotle left the city and went around in different places, which was rather common at the time for young thinkers. He is eventually called by Philip of Macedon, the king of Macedonia, to act as tutor for his son. Philip's son, as is very well known, it was Alexander. He came to be known as Alexander the Great. Aristotle's teaching of Alexander is an essential part of the whole Alexandrian legacy, both in the process of conquest, but also subsequently for centuries later as part of late antiquity in the East. After this period, Aristotle returns to Athens. See if I can find the date quickly. 335, between 335 and 323, where he founds his own school. It's called the Peripatetic School of Philosophy. Peripatetic means doing philosophy while walking. And also the Lyceum, which is where his students, in essence, copied in papyrus form many of his lessons, his lectures. So it is because of that we actually have so much of his work saved. It's essential to keep this in mind. I mean, Aristotle's philosophy has an extraordinary range. He wrote about practically everything. Obviously, about the most basic aspects of philosophy, which would be logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and so on, but significantly and equally matters of science, natural science, physics, geology, botany, zoology. He also wrote works on rhetoric and on poetics, which would be in today's terms, sort of literary studies. His work on poetics is famous because of his account of Athenian tragedy. And he also wrote works of what we today would call psychology or anthropology. We will definitely address these aspects later on. Because these would be works that would generally concern what it means to be human. But of course, he's most famously known and often mostly quoted for his works on ethics and politics, which clearly we will deal with as well. He was like, in fact, all of Greek philosophers, not particularly friends to democracy. He wasn't an enemy of democracy the same way that Plato was. So in a sense, his account of Athenian democracy is fairly impartial, and therefore has become a great source for us to understand how it worked. So this is definitely something that we will be concentrating on. As other introductory remarks, I should mention just a couple more things. It is as I said, the reason that we have so much of Aristotle's work saved, that we have access to it, was primarily because his students were very vigilant in recording it, we would say, in today's terms. However, if it wasn't for the Islamic philosophers in the medieval era, between the 800 and 1400, basically, that's the period we're talking about, Aristotle would be unknown in the Western world, because they translated extensively his works, many of which sort of had been lost from the Latin tradition, and in fact commented extensively on it, so that Aristotelian philosophy is in many ways one of the foundations of what we call Islamic philosophy. He was called the first teacher. Equally, the tradition in Christian theology, that the medieval tradition in Christian theology that is called scholasticism, and also the work of course, of Thomas Aquinas, who referred to Aristotle very simply as the philosopher, are also the reason why Aristotle remains so important in the Western tradition. In some ways, we can say that his work exists almost continuously through the centuries, because various of its aspects were deemed relevant at various phases. For example, the work on ethics and issues of virtue and so on were crucial to the Renaissance. The work on science was crucial to, let's say, someone like Francis Bacon. The work on politics was crucial to someone like Karl Marx, or of course the great Enlightenment thinkers, starting from John Locke and onward, even certainly in the French tradition. So we have a philosopher who though no doubt belongs to an archaic society, to an ancient world. This should not be forgotten. We should not treat Aristotle as if he's a thinker that belongs to our world. That's for sure. Nonetheless, his work remains remarkably relevant in all kinds of ways. So I will proceed by in basically 3 sections, which will be based around 3 words, which I will bring up here in just a second. Here you go. The first word is Archē in Greek. Archē is pronounced in English. In English, it means both origin and rule. Rule in the sense, obviously, of power. Who in fact is the ruler in a given polity. But also in the other meaning of rule in English, which means principle. And given that it also means origin or beginning, the beginning of things, oftentimes the term is used to simply describe what Aristotle himself first named first principles, which would be the foundational principles of any process of thinking, right? And of any process of knowledge, frankly, which would include science. So that would be the first term we will look at by reading a couple of sections from Aristotle's Politics. The second term that I'm interested in is the term Philia, as you see. In English, this means friendship. In Greek, Philia also is used, is one of the terms for love. And it is obviously the kind of love that's pertinent to friendship, which in the Greek world can be both erotic and non-erotic. We will look into these things in detail. But the most significant aspect of Philia is that it straddles a range of discourses or disciplines. For Aristotle, or in Aristotle's work, it's primarily discussed in the context of ethics. But as we will see, even there, it's a term that has explicitly political significance, and also we could say an overall anthropological significance. That is to say, it is part of the various discourses about what it means to be human. The third section and final section would be on the notion of psyche, and I would insist that in English we keep talking about it as psyche and not as soul. The reason being that the word soul is completely, as it were, conquered by Christian theology. It's very difficult for us to discuss the notion of soul outside of a certain kind of Christian provenance. So we will stick with the term psyche, which we will see that comes from the main work that is considered to be part of Aristotle's psychology work, in Latin, De Anima, Peripsychis in Greek, which discusses the animating substance of all living being, not just of humans. It's a very interesting, it's sort of groundbreaking discourse at the time, and subsequently very influential. We'll get to talk more about it when we get there. In the process of this, I'm scrolling down to another set of terms, which will be discussed in a contextual fashion as we talk about those three ones that the three ones I just showed. The first one is the notion of anthropos, right? In English, it obviously means human, not man, not in a masculine sense. Anthropos is really not a gendered notion. It's just simply the term that denotes the human animal, actually. We will also inevitably, unavoidably, discuss the term polis, which is the Greek word for city. Unfortunately, in various languages, including German and French, the term is often translated as state, sometimes a city-state. I object to both of these notions because they're very modern understandings of how the Greeks understood the concept of polis, which was really less a political term, even though the very word political comes from the word polis. It's less a political term and more a term of society. A polis is really a certain kind of social organization. In fact, the difficulty of separating the political from the social is very, very much part of this discussion. And we will see how this works in all the terms that the three terms that I've chosen. Along with this, I will end with a little discussion on this other last term, which is completely Aristotelian. It exists only in Aristotle. The term is in Greek zoon politikon, which very simply means political animal. The phrase is famous, humans are political animals. And we will need to unpack this notion and to try to figure out exactly in what sense the word political is used here, and also why Aristotle might insist on using the term animal, and insist on using an understanding of living being in the context, in some sort of, in a certain political context. So we're proceeding with our next section, which is the one on the concept of Archē. So I'm going to read from the third book of Politics, and we'll proceed from there. So he says, the capacity to rule and be ruled. Rule and ruled you can think of in terms of governing and being governed, okay? The capacity of rule and to be ruled is praised, and being able to do both well is held to be the virtue of a citizen. Citizen here really is the literally the person of the polis, right? As he will say later on in the quote that is specifically significant. There is a kind of rule exercised over those who are similar in birth and free. This we call political rule. A ruler must learn by being ruled, just as one learns to be a cavalry commander by serving under a cavalry commander, or to be a general by serving under a general, etc. Hence, this too can be said that one cannot rule well without having been ruled. And whereas the virtues of these are different, he means, commanders and so on versus citizens, a good citizen must have knowledge and ability both to be ruled and to rule. And that is the virtue of a citizen. So just a quick gloss on some of these terms. First of all, as I said, rule and rule could be translated as governing and being governed. The notion of political rule is something that should be literally understood. A political here means that which pertains to the polis, right? That which is something that one finds only in this particular form of society, as opposed to any other. And of course, he's talking about democracy, right? Not any other form of government. So we must not forget that of course Archē means both origin and rule, right? Much in the sense that, and in English we understand rule to be to pertain to both matters of governance and to matters of principle. Indeed, first principles, as we said, which would be kind of the essential rules of the game. Of any game, really. I mean, I'm talking about language games or any kind of philosophical or, in fact, practical matters. Our understanding of ruler is usually, a sort of primary figure, right? The primary figure in a kind of, mechanism or framework of ruling or governing that presupposes that person to be not only the one who decides, but a kind of guardian of the set of rules that that person represents. So in an archaic, society, an archaic configuration of power, the ruler the ruler commands authority not only over the domain of rules that govern society, but he also sort of embodies the point of departure of whatever would be the trajectory such rules are to have in their implementation, into their becoming reality, whether they are to be enforced in principle or not, whether they should be safeguarded for future generations, again, of rulers and ruled, or in fact dismantled in favor of another course of rules or of another beginning. So, I mean, a perfect example would be, of course, the figure of the patriarch or the figure of the monarch. But when Aristotle demands that the ruler and the ruled, that the ruler must also be ruled or must also have the sense of being ruled, something else that is taking place, and this is really essential. We can say that the kind of singularity of this concept of Archē, the primary principle, the primacy of ruler, is kind of taken apart by a certain kind of otherness that might be said to exist inside it. So we could say it this way: in order to know how to rule, one must know how to be ruled. Knowledge of being ruled, by the way, does not mean just simply the experience from the standpoint of being ruled. You know, people who are customarily ruled because they have no access to power, they can give an account of their experience, which is usually something that means that they're oppressed. He really does not mean that at all. What he means is knowing the other side of rule. Okay, being ruled is knowing the other side of rule. Knowing how to be ruled means the other side of rule, which is a certain kind of investment in the object of rule from a position of subjectivity, right? From the position of authorization that is not, consumed in the typical account of how one is objectified by being ruled, by being always ruled. Okay, so being ruled in this sense provides, in fact, a certain sort of knowledge. I mean, the verb that Aristotle uses there is the verb mathin, which means learning, right? One cannot be a ruler, he says, unless one has learned how to be ruled. So learning is an essential concept here, which means that by virtue of that, the kind of monopoly over the authority that rulers have is displaced, is relativized. And the kind of quintessential distinction between rulers and ruled, between the power on one hand and lack of power on the other, is in fact dismantled. He, as he says later on lines 12-27 in the same chapter, the rule of the free is known from both sides. The rule of the free is known from both sides. There is in that sense a kind of coincidence of knowledge, which has to be considered from these two standpoints. On the one hand, you can say that the ruled are the ones who authorize their position as ruled, right? They're not ruled in the simple sense of submitting to the authority of the ruler, right? To some authority that's predicated on the assumption that, according to the concept of Archē, remember it, which means both rule and origin, that they're not subjugated to an authority that's predicated on the assumption that the ruler is also the origin of rule, like a king is, when they're born into being a king. In this context that he's describing, people are ruled by virtue of their own decision to be ruled, which means that they're ones who pose the questions and give meaning to the questions: who rules, why, and how? Which is, if you think about it, is the very mode of interrogating the rule of law. So that the rule of law is not something that's given transcendentally, impersonally, like it often is in modern societies, according to constitutions and so on. But it is actually something that is always made by the citizens who then make themselves obey it. Okay, so in a certain way, the ruled are the ones who control the whole framework of what it means to rule and to be ruled. And that's, in that sense, they can never be put in a kind of servile position. To give an example, which is rather stark, in Athens, slaves are not ruled, strictly speaking. They merely execute commands. It's astonishing, most people don't know, that the police in ancient Athens were conducted by slaves. The police work was conducted by slaves. There were the famous Scythian archers, in fact, who were extraordinary archers, That's because the police in Athens is not involved in any kind of lawmaking, and by no means can the police improvise on the basis of a certain law. They're there to execute the law, so they arrest a thief. But how they arrest a thief cannot be subject to their own judgment, because they are strictly instruments of the law. These people are not citizens. The citizens are never instruments of the law. So it's kind of interesting. We have to. That's, by the way, also true of women and children who belong to a whole other realm called the oikos, where the word economy comes from, which is the household, where in fact women very much control the rules of the household. All of this is exempted from what he's talking about. That's why he says similar in birth and free. By this, of course, is we're talking about the patriarchal kind of society that the Greek society was, where the men were the free citizens, and obviously it's only pertinent to them. But we're not here to glorify Athenian society, or to even use it as a kind of model in a social sense. Obviously, we have thankfully grown beyond this kind of situation. But if we were to look at it formally, to the degree that it involved real equality, where in fact ruling was a matter in which everyone participated, then in fact it is very useful and enabling. So ruling becomes a condition shared by the free and equal. Okay, this is what he says. And he calls this political rule, right? Politiki Archē, which means the rule of the polis. So by this logic, a ruler who's never known how to be ruled, okay, cannot possibly rule without, in fact, abusing that autonomy in favor of ruling in its name. So that's one side. The other side, thinking of this argument, we can say that Aristotle's configuration of Archē also subverts the idea of ruler as a primordial authority, which is why his comments are pertinent only to democracy and not monarchy. I'm talking about the double meaning of the concept archē, right? We talked about rule, now I'm talking about origin and primacy. So as in that sense, a person who is ruled, sorry, I didn't say it right. Insofar as a ruler knows how to be ruled, a ruler can never claim to be the first and only, right? At most, he can acknowledge the position of being ruler as a kind of provisional moment, a kind of transitory moment in a process of ruling. Which is a process whose beginning in some ways is irrelevant, and whose end point, well, there isn't an end point, because the end point is a certain arbitrary moment by which this person is substituted by another. So in that sense, for a ruler to recognize that he's also ruled, at some point will be ruled again, has been, and at some point will be ruled again, means that as a kind of subjectivity, no ruler can claim some kind of total authority. There's a certain kind of otherness that creeps in always in the process. So if then knowing how to be ruled is essential to ruling, Archē, rule, cannot be a singular origin. There's something differential, as I said, that exists in the middle. So in this respect, this kind of a relation between the positions of ruler and ruled, remember, they're positions, they're not substances. One is not a ruler by virtue of having been born a ruler. One is a ruler only because at that particular point he has come to be the ruler, and just as easily will come to no longer be ruler. Okay, so in this respect, this kind of otherness that binds these two positions is not does not disintegrate into some kind of opposition. In essence, they are complicit in the same process. In that sense, you might say there's a certain kind of equal sharing of power, right, among people who occasionally perform the position of ruler and occasionally perform the position of being ruled. But in essence, they are in both positions. Politically speaking, they're in both positions simultaneously. So I will read another phrase from later on in the book, in the same in book 3, 1275a is the line. Aristotle says a citizen is simply determined above all matters in sharing or participating in the judgment. Sorry, in sharing and participating in judgment and rule. Okay, sharing, participating is the same verb that I've translated in 2 ways, both sharing and participating, because it is literally both. That is to say, no citizen occupies a position of rule or a position of origin, Archē, but in fact shares in that position with someone else, with not someone else, with all other citizens. It's a kind of, if we look at the Greek verb more literally, it's kind of existing within this process, right? Sharing is a kind of existence within a process that is common to every citizen. So, so in that sense, insofar as Archē becomes a matter of sharing, okay, it is simultaneously pluralized. It can never belong to just one person. So in democracy, rule can only be shared. If it's not shared, it does not exist. I know it sounds self-evident, but we really need to take it quite seriously. Archē, again, remember, we're talking about in the polis, right? Not just anywhere, is not concentrated in a single figure, some kind of apex in the social structure, but distributed equally throughout the entire realm of public life. In fact, in a very much in the common space where the city has its center, that in Greek is called agora, about which a lot of things have been written. So the issue, let's say, of power or sovereignty is literally passed from one individual to another, from one group to another, in a kind of regular cycle, so that command and obedience, rather than being sort of being opposed to each other as sort of two absolute ends, become two inseparable aspects of the same exact relationship, right? Later in the Politics, Aristotle will also talk about Archē in relation to a certain kind of primacy in experience of freedom. It's sort of, let's say, existential liberty, to which he in fact connects a democracy. He's talking about for him, liberty is to live as one likes, but to live as one likes doesn't mean that you do whatever you want, right? To live as one likes is a condition of being that, politically speaking, is maybe expressed by the desire not to be ruled by anyone, or to, in fact, to rule and be ruled in turn, to the necessity of sharing rule. Not to be ruled by anyone means not to be ruled by anyone outside this little double situation that I've just described. Because if one is ruled by anyone who does not know how to be ruled, or who refuses to recognize what it means to be ruled, then we are, of course, ruled by a tyrant. And that and then that turns being ruled into a condition of having no power, as it is in some ways very much the case in societies we live in today. But in a real democracy, in the way that Aristotle would imagine it, and to some extent existing in Athens, again always within the framework of the gender framework in which Athens was operating, of course. In that context, the democratic context, being ruled means having power. Okay, not in the sense, of course, of lobbying or having kind of a clientelist relation to those who are representing you, like a representative democracy, but in having power in the sense that one authorizes the moment of being ruled, much as one authorizes the specific persons who are at this point, and only at this point, and very provisionally, are in the position of ruling. So here we are in the third section. The word concept we're discussing here is philia, friendship. And the discussion is famously conducted in this book, the Nicomachean Ethics, from which I will be reading a couple of passages. I should say that Aristotle's discussion of friendship is notorious and has been discussed endlessly, perhaps even fashionably, I would say, these days. I'm not going to account for all that. I want to talk about some very, very specific things that will give us, that will link to what came before and what is coming afterwards. I should say, though, just as an introduction, that Aristotle's discussion of friendship gives us a rather special, I would say, unique insight into how the Greeks, I understood friendship to be a factor in social relations that goes beyond what usually discussed. Let's say in anthropology, where the primary mode of social relations is of course kinship, or family, right? Family relations, but also how social relations are discussed in politics, where it always breaks down one way or another in something that has to do with power, who rules whom and so on. So Aristotle's concept of friendship, I would argue, in some ways emerges from a certain kind of democratic understanding, or maybe from the experience of a democratic politics, because friendship is something that is connected to a very hardcore equality of being, right? A quality of being that it goes beyond just matters of politics, right, and power. So, from book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where friendship is introduced, these are sort of famous phrases that I'm quoting. He says, for without friends, no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods. So friendship, in that sense, emerges as a kind of existential necessity, but the word again is choosing. So a kind of not existential necessity in terms of the physical universe, some kind of biological requirement, but as a choice for living the kind of life, of human life, that matters, the good life, right? The free life. He then will say, just a few lines down, for with friends, men are more able both to think and to act. And so friendship becomes a clearly enabling condition that that facilitates, the process of thinking and of judging and of thinking intelligently and critically. So let me go to some notes that I have here. Let's see, pardon me for a second. So, as I said, for a thinker like Aristotle, who is formed by the traditions of Athenian democracy, even though one might say, his own experience of that coincides with democracy's decline, or maybe even democracy's suicide. His whole understanding, the whole understanding of the polis from which he draws his anthropology, is really specifically predicated against basic kinship structures. Now, this is not something that's Aristotle's invention. The reforms that were instituted in 507 BC by Clisthenes, who was at the time the ruler of Athens, who was an aristocrat who went very much against his class and changed the whole configuration by which politics would be conducted in Athens, was based on reconfiguring these political parameters against the kinds of politics of kinship, according to, let's say, tribal organization, that were not just simply the way of doing politics in Athens, but that were the way of doing politics in the entire archaic world. Certain tribes were superior to other tribes, and the leaders of those tribes were the leaders of society, sometimes at best with certain kind of circularity, or sharing between tribes. That is already a kind of advanced position. It constitutes, in Greek terms, very much of what is sort of Greek aristocracy, but oftentimes without that, by kind of entirely dynastic politics. So democracy is the at the kind of core level is the abolition of tribal organization, the abolition of kinship as the mode by which politics is conducted, where families and family rule and dynasties and hierarchies, patriarchal hierarchies, are the ways that politics is conducted. So, unlike Plato, who was terrified of democracy after all, Aristotle is the first philosopher to investigate this kind of unraveling of kinship. And he did this by this discussion on friendship, in my opinion. Just as a parenthesis, I should say that the unraveling of kinship is already conducted in Athens by the tragedies, by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, whose plays very much show the problematic relation or the problematic basis on which society might conduct itself if it is going to be on the basis of family rule. So after all, these plays were put staged for the benefit of a democratic society. So that was very, very deliberate. And I should also say, this is a parenthesis still, but a very important one. The tragedies took place while the city was in constant war for almost a century. Right? I mean, post-Persian wars and then the Peloponnesian War. Aristotle's work comes, of course, in the aftermath of that, in the defeat of Athens, as a result of this war and the demise of democracy as a result of its being weakened by these wars. All of this is incredibly important that I wish I had more time to discuss here, but as I said, you cannot do Aristotle in and out. So let's proceed. So the way that Aristotle discusses friendship is that it exceeds kinship, and therefore it pertains not to anthropology first, or even society first, but to an ethics, to how people deliberately, consciously choose to live. And I think that keep this in mind for the next segment when we discuss the notion of the political animal. Friendship is essential to the notion of the political animal. There is this essential phrase that I just read, that without friends no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods, should be connected to what is phrased later on, a few lines down. Friendship seems, and I'm going to read the whole quotation because it's very, very important. I'm reading now from, as I said, this text. Friendship seems to hold states together, sorry, cities together, wrong translation. Friendship seems to hold cities together, and lawgivers minded more than they do. Let me see if I can find the translation here. I have it better. Friendship seems to hold cities together, and lawmakers minded more than justice. For concord seems to be more like friendship and concord between people. And this they aim at most of all. While strife, and by this he means internal strife, as it is a condition of enmity, he says, they most seek to banish. And when men are friends, justice is no longer necessary, while being just demands adherence to friendship. Indeed, the highest form of being just seems to involve an element of friendship. So, this is stunning passage, and it has been interpreted, millions of times. So the most striking thing in this statement is Aristotle's establishing a kind of tension between friendship and justice, where the first, term being friendship, seems essential to the second, but also kind of impervious to it, right? He's saying that the very existence of friendship may be said to achieve justice. Well, justice itself cannot achieve its highest form without engaging friendship. Simply put, maybe, justice requires friendship in order to be fully achieved, while friendship is justice in itself. Now, the tension then is not a matter of opposition, but a kind of, let's say, asymmetrical relation. The opposition here is between friendship and an enmity, but specifically a specific kind of enmity, which in Greek is called stasis, which is the word for internal strife, often translated as civil war, but I prefer internal strife. So this latter thing, internal strife, is in fact enmity, insofar as it is opposed to friendship, but not enmity as such, right? Because after all, it is an internal affair, an affair between, erstwhile friends, right? Because it happens between people. The point is that there is no. I didn't say it right. The reason why he stages it this way is because friendship is essential to the structure of the polis, which includes all of its aspects, including, of course, its basic conflict, which exists in every society, right? So again, the phrase, for without friends none would choose to live, though he had all other goods, must be read with alongside of friendship seems to hold cities together, because the argument here is that the ethical realm, the existential realm, because friendship belongs to that, and the social or political realm are one and the same process in the realm of living. This is really, something that is particularly Greek. Again, a kind of lack of basic separation between an ethics that is pertinent to what an individual does in his or her life and, the political which pertains to society as a whole. This is really something that, particularly in a democratic city, is just inconceivable. It's just inconceivable. So what is friendship? Again, he will say in this book, the Politics, at one point, and it's very interesting that it exists in this book, Politics. Friendship is, he says, and I quote, the deliberate decision to live together. The deliberate decision to live together. And the key term here is, of course, deliberate. It's a matter of choice, because living together as a family, certainly not a matter of choice. So friendship is a kind of condition because of its deliberate aspect, because it is something that is done consciously and actively, as opposed to something that is inherited, as is family relations, kinship. It is something that includes all kinds of aspects, most significant of which is its own undoing, by virtue of course, conflict or strife, or stasis, right? Internal war. In this sense, I mean, the idea is that friendship is not just simply getting along, two people who are happy together and they get along, and they, on the contrary, one might say that in friendship, enmity or conflict can very much exist without being outside of friendship. People understand, I mean, Greeks understand that friendship is really conflictual in itself. And in that sense, it's very important to say that it has really nothing to do with some kind of Christian notion of loving thy neighbor, or being in that sense, always together in without differentiation. So I'm going to read a little more because I'm interested in something. Let me see here. Where am I? Sorry. Okay. So it's interesting that he will go on to say that friendship and justice, right? We were there. He's saying that I'm reading now from the second section of that book 8, where he's talking about friendship and justice again, and he's saying that the extent of their association, friendship and justice, is the extent of the association of people is the extent of their friendship, as it is the extent to which justice exists between them. The demands of justice, he says, also seem to increase with the intensity of the friendship, which implies that friendship and justice exist between the same persons and have an equal extension. So for the Greeks, especially in a kind of democratic framework, within which Aristotle is speaking, justice is always something that is that takes place between equals, right? It is the process where decisions are made about what is right and what is wrong, let us say, that are not authorized by something that exists outside the relationship of people who are free and equal. It's very interesting because it's very interesting because Aristotle will also say later on, in what is a very significant passage, that that a man and that a husband and a wife, in fact, can be friends. So friendship is not, first of all, exclusive to men, as is oftentimes understood, nor is it something that nor is it something that might exist outside some other kind of social institution like marriage. But it's very interesting that he differentiates the friendship between husband and wife as what he calls an aristocratic friendship. And by this, he means it is a friendship based on merit and on a certain kind of division of labor or division of tasks. So the reason why men and women can be friends is because they actually they have command over different realms according to, in fact, their capacity, according to their merit. Aristocracy is a term that's, of course, linked to merit. Aristocracy and meritocracy are very, very similar notions in the Greek world. He actually, understands friendship as a political idea that exists very much within the oikos, within the household. So this is one of the there are not that many instances, but one of the key instances where we can see how what is outside the political sphere proper enters the political sphere. I'm talking about the household. But I want to end with one other thing. This is from 150 lines 1159b in the same book on friendship, where he's talking about he's reiterating the fact that friendship can only happen among equals. He's saying, for example, I'm reading, in tyranny there's little or no friendship, for where there is nothing common to ruler and ruled, we'll go back to what we were before, there's no friendship either, since there is no justice, right? In a context where ruler and ruled are not the way we described, where being ruled is a certain form of power, is a certain form of ruling, but being ruled is simply being subjected to power. There is no justice. There's absolutely no justice in being subjected to power, and in that sense, there can be no friendship. So this is a notorious and was very influential statement throughout in the early modern era, that tyrants have no power. Tyrants have no friends. They may have alliances, they may have associations, they may have sycophants and others who are around them who claim to be their friends, but there cannot be any friendship among tyrants, because first of all, tyrants consider themselves to be alone in power. They cannot share, and second, because friendship would be the kind of condition where power would be interrogated, where wrong or anything that would be unethical in practice or in judgment would be contested, because, as I said, in friendship there is conflict is very much part of friendship. One last thing. In the same paragraph, going further down, he is talking about how one cannot be friends with a slave. This again has been misinterpreted. It's very interesting. He says one cannot be friends with a slave insofar as the person is a slave, but one can be friends with that person insofar as this person is a man. I mean, a person, right? So he undermines the idea that slavery bars friendship, or he introduces rather a kind of complex and some kind of complexity here, where friendship is something that can exist as a basic aspect of human being, as something that belongs to the human being as a certain kind of animality, okay, social animality, as we will see in a second, political animality, that somehow exceeds or certainly should be treated as separate from from friendship as something that is just a matter of one of the many social functions. Okay. So I'm running out of time, of course. As I said, it's impossible really to do Aristotle in an hour, and here we are in the last section. So I will have to move somewhat quickly, and perhaps not as much in detail as I would want to. I'm looking right now at the translation in this book. It's translated on the soul. It's a very good translation, except that it has that terrible word soul in it, which I am obviously objecting to. Which is the translation of Aristotle's work De Anima on the psyche, and I will read very quickly in order to go back to the concept of the political animal with which we will end. Suffice to say that for Aristotle, the psyche, as is not again some kind of transcendental notion of the soul that's separate from the body. There's no mind-body split in Aristotle whatsoever. Because things are corporeal. In that sense, he's a materialist. The psyche is a kind of basic animating substance that's pertinent to all living being, including plants. All living being has a psyche, and and then there's something peculiar to the human psyche that we will obviously underline. So he says in book 2, chapter 4, now the psyche is the cause and source of the living body. It's very interesting that what is translated here as source in Greek is archē, right? A kind of origin and maybe even rule, insofar as a kind of a principle on which the body can come to live. And then he would also say that change and growth, he says, also come from the psyche. Perception, he says, comes from the psyche, because perception for Aristotle is a certain kind of change, or it enacts a certain kind of change. And insofar as it enacts a certain kind of change, one can also speak of growth, not in a kind of progressive sense, right? But in what is for him an essential way of every entity, of every form coming to actualize itself in this process of being or life. Now, what is different in human beings, in the human animal, is a different kind of perception, or maybe an additional perception, or in addition to perception, which is a faculty that is translated fairly accurately as the imagination. So he will say that though all this sort of perception is present, I'm reading now from book 3, chapter 3, that perception is present in all animals. It's possible to think things through, though perception is present in all animals, it is possible to think things through falsely. And this is present in no animal in which there's also not speech. So perception in animals that have no speech is always, there's no falsity, right? Falsity in perception occurs in animals that exercise the imagination. And what is the imagination? He says, it is to make something appear before the eyes in the way people do who make images to fit things into a memory assisting scheme. What he's really talking about here is a kind of perception that is not just simply a response. I'm speaking in modern terms now, okay? There's not simply a response to stimulus, to something that actually exists and appears in the eye, and therefore is then judged or figured in the same way, but a kind of formulation of images of things that don't exist, of something that is not external, externally exist as stimulus. So he says, imagination is that by which we speak of some image as becoming present to us, rather than anything we might call, never mind that. Imagination is that by which we speak of some image as becoming present to us, right? So now I want to turn to a passage that I find particularly evocative. So he's talking about, he says that for the psyche that thinks, this is again book 3, chapter 7, for the psyche that thinks things through, for the psyche that thinks things through, imaginings are present in the way perceptible things are. And when it asserts or denies that something is good or bad, it flees or pursues. For this reason, he says, the psyche never thinks without an image. This is really the translation here. But the Greek word is not the word for image. The Greek word is phantasma, right? We can translate it straightforwardly as phantasm. Now, I understand how phantasm can be translated as image, because, from another standpoint, literally speaking, phantasm and fantasy in Greek etymology, the root of the word, is linked to the word for light. So there is, in that sense, a kind of elementary notion of phantasm as that which appears or comes to appear, and there comes to light. So the term, it can be used, but it's important that we don't get stuck on the concept of image, strictly speaking, and think of, take very seriously the notion of phantasm as a kind of entity that the mind, right? Because the psyche here is really that which animates the mind as intellect, but in all other aspects, really, because it includes certainly emotions. The mind is able to conjure objects, right? To conjure objects that don't exist in any kind of tangible sense, but are objects that nonetheless are perfectly real, insofar as they have real consequences. And the implication here is that this particular animal, the human animal, the psyche rather of this particular animal, the human animal, has this kind of extraordinary capacity to not just simply perceive the environment and what goes on around it, the other objects, the other animals, etc., the relations between things, but to conjure things, to conjure aspects in things or without things that come to exist by virtue of this conjuring. And it is very, very important, though I'm using the word conjuring, which with all of its implications, that this is not some kind of falsity. It's not some kind of delusion, okay? But it is really a basic function. Without the phantasmatic capacity of the psyche, no living being can live. This is really no human living being can live. Without the psyche, no living being can be. Without the phantasmatic capacity of the psyche, no human living being can be. So it's important to note this, because if we're going to make sense of this very bizarre term, the political animal, we really have to keep this in mind. I'm reading now again from my notes. Aristotle separates himself from Plato insofar as he describes the human animal, not just simply the animal that has language, a language-bearing animal, as of course he also said, and so did Plato, which is, I think, very wrongly translated often as the rational animal. The language-bearing animal, the animal that has logos, has nothing to do with an animal that is thinking rational. That of course is a mistranslation, very much a modern conception. So he exceeds Plato by giving another term that he calls political animal. So I'm going to read this quotation. It's from, we're going back in the beginning now, from Politics 1252b. I'm reading the quotation. Of the community or society composed of several villages, most perfect is the city, the polis. It has already achieved, as the story goes, the limit of self-sufficiency. And thus, though it comes to be for the sake of life, it exists for the good life. Though it has come to be for the sake of life, for simple life, it exists for the good life. It has kind of exceeded a kind of basic existence. Hence, every city exists by nature. This is a very important notion. Every city exists by nature, insofar as the first communities have come to exist. For the city is the completion or the end. The term is telos, very essential term to Aristotle. For the city is the completion or end of those communities, as nature is the completion or end, since everything by coming into being tends towards completion or end. This is very basic Aristotle, true of everything, every form in the universe for him. So as completion or end is the best of each thing, for the city, self-sufficiency is both completion and the best. From this, it is apparent, again, the notion has to do with, phantasm again, phaneron. From this, it is apparent that the polis exists by nature and the human is by nature a political animal. So the mobilizing hinge of this whole passage is this repeated qualifier, by nature. As I said, crucial to this is the thread of Aristotelian entelechy. That's the term that means whereby the perfectibility inherent in a thing is tantamount to this finitude. That is to say, that which is inside in the nature of anything comes to its perfection when it is completed, and also, of course, in that sense, when it ceases to exist. So equally significant to this qualifier by nature is also the condition of living being, whose perfectibility, or whose end, however, is specifically determined to be the work of human perfectibility, not just simply living, not just simple life, but the good life, not just any life, but a very specific kind of life that he famously described as the good life, which is, in this case, removed from some kind of Platonic attachment to philosophy, because for Plato, famously, the good life is really the life of the philosopher. Aristotle says nothing of the kind. So what he says is that from the trajectory from simple living to the good life, we can see a certain kind of process by which this animal becomes human, a process of humanization. In this sense, the human animal is a certain kind of surplus of a simple animality, something obviously different, something excessive, broader. I'm not going to say better, but something that is excessive or a simple animal, and it is animated by what he says, a communal bond. Yet not just any notion of community or society, because a great number of species are demonstrably social animals, right? But again, society is not even the proper thing, and it's very hard to say that the collectivity of the herd or the hive is a society, because and here we'll go back to the stuff that I just talked about a minute ago about the psyche, because it doesn't produce any phantasms. A beehive can sport splendorous and highly efficient architecture, but bees do not spend their time in the service of phantasms that will build them, rocket ships or extermination camps, because the phantasm and the capacity of the imagination is not necessarily good. It's not to do with good or bad. It is that which can create objects and things and institutions and practices that are not just simply matters of mere living, but exceed mere living. Some of these are, in fact, absolutely horrible, as we know, of course, from the history of humanity. So in that sense, there's something about human being, this is the society of human being, that determines this animal's life, that he calls political. So for Aristotle, the humanization of this animal that we call human, right, is achieved not by reference to some kind of natural capacity in the conventional sense of natural, which would be a certain kind of simple means of the physical universe, but by virtue of a certain kind of determination of humans belonging to a polis, by a certain kind of, as Aristotle is fond of saying often, a certain kind of choice, a deliberate act. So he does say, Aristotle does consider the existence of the polis a natural event. That's, every polis is by nature a polis, but only in the sense that it bears, the kind of coming to end or coming to perfectibility of a communal association. So it may be in the nature of the thing, polis, in the nature of the thing, city, to be this way, but it is not a matter of nature in terms of physical nature. It is a matter of nature by virtue of how human animals work, okay? And human animals work by the phantasms that their psyche creates. So we don't need to get hung up on any kind of determinism here. Instead, I think that we can say is what in this case animates human being, insofar as it enables this mode of society that we call polis, is predicated on sharing a communal mode of asking questions and questioning authorization of the law, whose ultimate consequence, of course, insofar as the democratic polis is concerned now, a very specific kind of polis, Athens being its epitome, is to break down social bonds that are based on kinship, or natural bonds of kinship, and create other ones, according to this kind of phantasm that Clisthenes named demos. So in this sense, to conclude, zoon politikon, political animal, does not pertain to a natural condition of animal as such. And this is very clear in Aristotle. The specific form of living being that Aristotle recognizes to be the nature of the polis, which remember is the good life, qualifies the matter of nature in living being in reverse. It is the political, the qualifier political that that demonstrates, expresses, or bespeaks the nature of the human animal, not the animal as such.